So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit different. I usually talk about nutrition or fasting or type 2 diabetes, but today I'm going to talk about financial conflicts of interest and really how it influences medicine, and it really shouldn't be. So the question is really how we got to this stage, because, you know, as doctors, we are really supposed to be part of the solution, not part of the problem, but increasingly, doctors are seen as part of the problem, and you can see it everywhere. So this is on CNN, for example, with the opioid crisis. New York doctors wrote more opioid prescriptions after pharma payments. And it's like, okay, well, that doesn't sound very good for us. This is in New York Magazine, for example. Are doctors to blame for the opioid crisis? New Yorkers think so, right? And it's like, okay, this is not good. This is all actually from the last couple of months. It's all come from, 2018. So we're increasingly seen not as people who are safeguarding the health of our population, but sort of people who just sort of perpetuate this problem. And it all comes down to the fact that we're seen as pawns of big pharma or other corporate interests, when really we should be looking after the health of our patients, not trying to promote this. So for example, Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York is a very, very famous cancer hospital. And this is Craig Thompson, who's the chief executive officer. And he was sitting on the board of Merck, one of the giant pharmaceutical companies. And everybody is wondering, rightly, hey, if you are taking all this money from Merck, from Big Pharma, how can you be looking after the interests of patients? And then the answer is he can't really. And he was paid $300,000 a year by Merck. He took $6.7 million home in 2016. And it's like, well, if you're taking money from them, like, where do your loyalties really lie? This is another Sloan Kettering doctor. So this is Jose Baselga, again, in the New York Times, basically exploding this all over the front pages. This doctor is one of the top breast cancer doctors in the world, really, one of the top 2 or 3 in the last 10 years. And he, in 87% of the papers he wrote, he never actually disclosed that he's taking all this money. So he's basically hiding it because regulations say that you really have to tell people if you have a financial conflict of interest. And he sat on the board of Bristol Myers Squibb, another big pharmaceutical. He is the director of this Varian Medical Systems, which sells to Memorial Sloan Kettering, so yet another financial conflict of interest. So he had to resign as well. From the New York Times, another study, for example, this was supposed to be an unbiased study of drinking. So there's the National Institute of Health said, well, let's study if alcohol drinking is actually good for you, because a lot of observational data says if you drink 1 to 2 drinks a day, it's actually pretty healthy, but we don't actually have any data. So let's get the data. So the NIH goes to this doctor, Dr. Mukamal, and he immediately goes to all the alcoholic industry and tries to get funding for this. And of course, you don't want the alcohol industry writing a paper to see if drinking alcohol is good for you. Like, you don't have to be that smart to understand that you want an unbiased trial of this. And yet, here he is trying to get millions of dollars, and they have email after email of the alcohol industry people saying, well, you should do it like this, you should do it like this. Well, if you do it like this, it'll look bad for us, so you shouldn't do it. And this lead investigator is saying, yeah, you're right, please give me money. It's like, okay, but you've biased the trial so badly right from the start that the NIH had to actually pull the funding and stop the study. So this is all of these stories are like within the last 6 months. So this is all the ways that we got into this mess, which is the financial conflicts of interest in medicine. And unfortunately, it's basically corrupting all of medicine and what we do. So there's lots of ways. The first way that most of us are very familiar with is that they just pay you straight out. So this is doctors, and this is the insider's view. So this is Dr. Relman, and he is a former editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, which is one of the top medical journals in the world. And what he said was that they're slowly being bought by the pharmaceutical industry, not only in terms of the practice of medicine, but also teaching and research. And this is an insider's view. Like, this is a guy who knows what he's talking about. He spent decades being one of the editors of the top journals. And what does he mean? Well, if you take a look at how much contact physicians have with the pharmaceutical industry, well, it's everywhere. And these are basically gifts to doctors. So it's not as bad as it used to be, but it's still pretty bad. And 94% of patients had ties to the pharmaceutical industry. And these are, of course, a conflict of interest because we're supposed to be on the side of the patient. We're not supposed to be on the side of prescribing drugs just for the hell of it, right? We're supposed to be looking after our patients, and if we take money from these pharmaceuticals, we're going to look favorably on it. Everybody knows that, so why do we allow it? But 94% of physicians do it. And what they see, again, New York Times, so this is all out there, it says that people don't even understand that if they get gifts, it is going to influence their opinion. It's like, why do you think they give gifts in the first place? It's so you look favorably on them, right? It's like, come on, you got into medical school. You're not that stupid. But 61% of medical students felt that gifts did not influence their own behavior, right? That is corruption. It's only a problem for somebody else. Right? It doesn't influence them. They don't see that. They don't have the self-awareness to see that. Of course, if you take a big gift, if you take $300 million from Merck, you think Merck is great. And this is the thing. If you look at the published study, so this is in the public journal of medicine, what you can see is that if you compare, sorry, this is a little small. So if you look at the blue bar here, those are the people the physicians that got gifts from pharmaceutical, and the red bar is the ones that didn't get any gifts. So what you can see in almost every case, and these are by specialty, so general surgery, urology, in almost every single case, doctors who got gifts from pharmaceuticals prescribed more pharmaceuticals. So the evidence is very clear, as if we needed it, that if pharmaceutical companies give gifts to doctors, they give more drugs because you feel good, and therefore you give more. But it's not in the interest of health. It was all just advertising. So this was a very interesting study here talking about pharmaceutical firms. And what they did was they sent a number of doctors to sort of a free conference in a sunny location, all expenses paid, symposium. So really stuff that happens like every single day. And then they asked them, they tracked their use of the drug. So you see in drug A, the use of that drug went up by 335%. In drug B, it went up by 225%. And then they asked them, hey, do you think that symposium had anything to do with your medical practice? Which it clearly did. 95% of doctors said, no, not a problem. Not a problem at all. Like, it doesn't influence me at all. This is what doctors think. This is what you see. You see your mentors doing it. You see your colleagues doing it. Hey, they sent Dr. XYZ to Phoenix in the winter. They went to like St. Lucia and all that. But hey, it's okay. They're doctors. They're above this thing, right? Corruption. Only a problem for somebody else. When the data is right in front of us, that it clearly influences their practice, and not in a good way, in a way that increases expenses for everybody else. The drug might or might not be good. And if you thought that the universities are free of it, it's like the worst place in the world. The universities are the most corrupted places in the world. You thought that people taught at prestigious institutions for the good of mankind. That might have been why they went there in the first place, but they stayed for the money. If you look at the number of articles and citations that researchers do, these guys out at the top, where they're writing 600 articles, 1,000 articles, these are the guys at Harvard, Yale, everywhere. Well, that's the amount of money on the y-axis there. That's the amount of money they get. So there's a clear correlation the more prestigious a doctor, the more money they're getting from the pharmaceutical, right? So it's like, okay, you think that this guy who teaches at Harvard University is giving you an impartial opinion. You shouldn't be talking to him. You should be talking to your family physician who is getting the, you know, $10 pen, right? Not the $500,000, right? It just is a terrible system. But yet these people are the people that are in the newspaper. They're the ones that are teaching medical students. They're the ones who are teaching the dietitians, the pharmacists, everybody. These highly, highly corrupted people who don't even know it. 95% of them think they're really good people. But this is from the Mayo Clinical Proceedings. And again, you can see exactly the same thing. This is the number of speakers who went before the FDA to help promote a drug. And you see that this is the amount of money that they get. So there's like 182,000. There's an outlier, if you can't see this, one person who met outlier criteria with payments totaling $2.8 million. It's like these are the people who are arguing to the FDA that drugs should or should not be approved for certain indications. And almost every single one of them is taking hundreds of thousands of dollars. And this is in a system that we allow. This is in front of everybody. This is public knowledge. This is stuff that's out there, but nobody ever talks about. Why? Because you're not getting Harvard University to talk about it, because all their doctors are on the take. That's why we talk about it here, because this is the truth. So you have this situation now where all these doctors who are trying to point out the problem basically just try and get shut down. Like Malcolm Kendrick, like he's disappearing from the internet. They shut him down in terms of Wikipedia. This guy, Steve Nissen, for example, he says, well, if you're against statins, you're like an anti-vaxxer. That's what he says, right? And it's like, well, he's also the guy who's taking all the money from Amgen and Pfizer and everything, right? So it's not an unbiased opinion. And then you get like crazy, crazy stuff, like talking about the statins, that, oh, everybody should be getting it. They should be putting it in the drinking water. Everybody over the age of 50 should be getting it. It's like, where are these opinions coming from? Because if you look at the actual science, which Malcolm does, it's not there. There's nothing to support that sort of use to put these drugs into the mouths of millions of patients. Yet, as a family physician, as a medical student, you get taught by these people, then they write guidelines that you're almost forced to follow, because otherwise you're not following standard of practice. So you're almost forced to give these because they wrote that guideline. So what happens when you stop statins? Well, in France, there was actually a sort of natural experiment where this happened. So there was a controversy in 2012, 2013. There was some big controversy. The discontinuations increased by 50%. And so everybody's like, oh, people are going to die. People are going to die. It's like, what happened? What didn't happen was they didn't die. So if you look at mortality, 558 in 2012 and 556 in 2013. Cardiovascular deaths, 32.2 in 2012, 31.6 in 2013. So it's like, here's all these big, people who are raising all this ruckus. Oh, if you talk about statins, people are going to die. People are going to get a heart attack. They don't die. They don't get heart attacks. You're just trying to give it to the right people. And this is the problem, is that there are a population of people who take these drugs who should. But that's a relatively small amount. Then it's like, oh, but you don't make money by selling a small amount of drug. You make money by selling a large amount of drug. So you want to push it out into the general population so that everybody over 50 is taking this stuff. But it's not that useful. And this is what it showed. And then you got crazy, crazy, stupid stuff, right? So this guy, John Sievenpiper at the University of Toronto, so he says that, well, fructose, like sugar, first of all, like everybody knows that sugar is not really a health food. And this is what he says, that where fructose was once endorsed and later renounced, it is now in a position to be endorsed again. So fructose, it's a health food. It's like, okay, that's crazy. And he says there's a need to clarify the benefits. Okay, forget cutting down on sugar. He's saying, we should be doing studies on how it's really good to eat more sugar. It's like, okay, how does that even work? It's like, how can you be a professor at a university and think these crazy, stupid thoughts? Well, like, here's his conflicts of interest. Coca-Cola, 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 the Coca-Cola Advisory Board, and Coca-Cola. Okay, well, now I see why you think Coca-Cola is a health food, right? Put it next to the kombucha. The whole problem is that they have no insight into the fact that their opinions have been corrupted. They think that these are, hey, this nice lady from Coca-Cola is giving me all this money, and therefore this must be my opinion, this must be what's right. And then so this is what happens. It winds up in one of our national newspapers. Oh, hey, they get hundreds of thousands of dollars from soft drink makers. And this is at the university. He's a professor at the University of Toronto. That's where I'm from. So if you look at the financial conflicts of interest specifically for sugar, what's really interesting is that in the Annals of Internal Medicine, so another very highly regarded journal, they looked at the reporting bias between sugar-sweetened beverages and weight gain. So here's all the studies. These are the number of trials. So if you have no association on the left, there's about 26 trials that showed that there's no association between drinking sugary beverages and getting fat. And on the right-hand side, positive association, there's about 32, 33 that says there is an association. If you drink more sugary beverages, you gain more weight. So it's about even, you'd say. So if you just look at the data and you say, okay, well, it's about like, say, 34 to 26. It's not a slam dunk. It's not like every single study shows that drinking sugar makes you fat. Well, let's break it down. This is what the study did. Let's break it down to who sponsored the study. And this is what you show. Like 83.3% of the studies that showed no association, surprise, were sugar funded, like that guy, Stephen Piper. And when you actually have this in the red, which is not sugar funded, almost every study shows that, yes, drinking sugary beverages actually makes you gain weight, which is sort of like it's not that difficult to understand because we all knew this. Your grandmother knew it. Your great-grandmother knew it. If you eat a lot of sweets, if you eat a lot of candy, you eat a lot of sugar, you're going to gain weight. But this is the problem. They can simply pay researchers to do studies that show that, hey, it's not that bad, and then say, look, it's not that obvious. Like, there's studies that show it doesn't make you gain weight. There's lots of studies. There's like 26 studies that show that it does not make you gain weight. Of course, almost all of them are funded by the sugar industry. So this is the problem, is that if you have evidence-based medicine, but the evidence base upon which you base your facts is so corrupted, then you have to throw the whole thing out. So there's lots of different ways that the pharmaceuticals actually corrupt medicine. So there's the gifts, of course. There's the advisory board membership, which is, most of us know this. They invite you out, and they say, we're going to get your advice. But they actually have no interest in what you're talking about. They just want to sit you down and show you an ad for an hour and then give you like $1,000. That's all that happens, right? So there's honoraria for attending meetings. So we'll send you to the American Board of Cardiology meeting at so-and-so, right? And it's several $1,000s of airfare and hotel and so on. You have speaking fees for these talks, all those dinner talks that everybody gets invited to. So those are interesting because when you actually talk to pharmaceutical representatives, they actually have nothing about education. They just want to pay that doctor $1,000, $2,000 so that they'll look favorably upon their things. There's consulting fees, travel expenses, and then participating in clinical trials. So that's at the level of the doctor. There's a lot of problems. But it actually goes much, much, much beyond just paying the doctors, not just the regular doctors who are caught in this, but also all the academic doctors. But the journals themselves are very biased as well. So this is, again, the insider's view. So Richard Horton in 2015 made a comment. in The Lancet, so again, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world, that said the case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, and he's talking about health, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. It's like, wow, this is a guy who spent his career looking at the science, and he thinks it's crap. That's very interesting because that tells you a lot about what we should do. So this is more ways that they influence the practice of medicine, and that's industry payments to editors. So remember, the editor of journals have a lot of power. Okay? So they decide what gets published, what doesn't get published. If you write something like, statins are bad, they can decide not to publish it. So they actually, form the conversation. They direct the conversation. So they should be impartial, because that's what we all as physicians rely upon. Well, here's, so this in the BMJ 2017, looked at very, very influential journals and how much money editors are being paid by this. So look at the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. On average, each editor is getting $475,000 in that year. That's crazy. With 35 editors, that's about $15 million. Every year, almost $500,000 going straight into that doctor's pocket. And it's like, I wonder why they're all pushing drugs and devices. It's like, if I'm getting $500,000, I'd be like sort of slightly partial too. And then there's all this research, right? So on average, JAMA, for example, $84,000 per editor per year. $84,000. And we all know that if you get research money, it goes a lot of different ways, but a lot of it goes to, paying for that conference in Hawaii, because it's like, yeah, there's this conference on this and this and this, and it happens to be held in Hawaii. Like, you could learn the same thing in your underwear in front of your computer, It's like, you don't have to go to Hawaii for that. But of course, research dollars can do that. So then you go to Hawaii. And it's like, no wonder that Jack loves devices. Like, it pays this private school bills, right? Mo money, baby. That's what I say. So for the practice physician, it's like, no pen for you. Right? But for the journal editor, here's a couple $100,000, right? So here's the crazy part, right? So you go to a conference these days, you can't even get a pen. That's the rules, okay? So I go to the American Society of Nephrology, and about 5 or 8 years ago, they say you can't give out any free stuff, not even a pen. Okay, and it's like, I think that's pretty reasonable. So you used to go around, you used to collect a bunch of like drug stuff, right? That's the way it used to be, and now it's all gone. So that's good. But it's because we know that that's corrupting. So that's gone, but we don't talk about what about the journal editors, who's far more influential than one physician. You can't even get a pen without us thinking that you're going to be biased, but we allow journal editors to get $500,000 per year. That's crazy. In the New England Journal of Medicine, so another way that they corrupt the evidence is to publish very influential articles. So this is talking about bisphosphonates and fracture risks. So if you take bisphosphonates for a very long time, they cause fractures because they're not that great drugs. But anyway, they published this in 2010 in the New England Journal of Medicine, which says that fracture rates from lucrative bisphosphonates are very rare. That's what they said. It's like, well, who wrote this? Well, if you look up here, it's like Klein Nutrition paid for Dr. Bucci Reichwig being a full-time employee. You have a full-time employee of the company that makes this drug writing an article telling doctors that this drug is not that bad. Really, you don't see any conflict of interest in it? And it's like, well, the journal is obviously making a lot of money from this, but practicing physicians are going to rely on review articles in the New England Journal of Medicine, not realizing that they're actually written by the company. It's like, that's insane. Like, it's a total conflict of interest. This other one, Dr. Santora and DePape being full-time employees and having equity interests in Merck. It's like, you think they might have an interest in Merck being able to sell more drugs, even if it's harmful? Like, what we're talking about is these are drugs that can be harmful, and they're downplaying the risk, but they're employees of that. Like, how is it that the New England Journal of Medicine, our top journal, actually allows that? It's so biased. There's other ways they do that. So there's reprint income. So if you ever go to your drug rep, they buy stacks of these reprints, and they hand them out to family physicians and other physicians. And it's not a small part of the money they make, because if you look at reprint income, the Lancet gets 41% of its income from selling reprints to drug companies. So drug companies will buy reprints of articles that are favorable and start handing them out like candy. So the Lancet gets 41%, the American Medical Association gets 53% of their income from reprints. So it's like if they print a good article, they can turn it into a blockbuster, which is great for the journal. Their impact factor goes up. And they get a lot of money as that Merck or whatever buys tons and tons of these reprints, right? So who needs journalistic ethics when there's a Mercedes in the driveway, right? That's the whole point. This is not good medicine. This is the stuff that gets out there and actually traps the honest doctors who are looking at this and saying, well, I trust the New England Journal of Medicine. That's my journal. It's like, it's corrupt. That's what the insiders have said. The whole thing is a pile of crap. So you can look again at the association between the industry affiliation with rosiglitazone. So here's yet another example. If you look at rosiglitazone, so this is Avandia, so it's a drug that was causing heart attacks, eventually got pulled, right? When they looked at the authors who had conflicts of interest, they were 3 to 4 times more likely to have a favorable risk of the risk of heart attacks. So if you have so-called experts who have taken money from the drug company, they look much more favorably and downplay the risks of heart attack, even though it wound up being shown that this was actually a real risk, right? But these doctors, these researchers, actually don't know anything about that. So that's biased journals. Then you have selective publication. So journals publish articles, and you assume that that's the evidence base upon which we evaluate whether medicines are good or not. So here's the insider's view. So Marcia Angal said it is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published, or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. And again, this is the former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. So this is an insider who spent decades working at evidence-based medicine, saying that evidence-based medicine is actually so corrupt as to be useless or harmful. This is basically what she's saying, and she reached this conclusion only after several decades of being in it. So this was a study done in the New England Journal of Medicine looking at selective publication. So when you do studies, you send them out to the journal to get published. And the problem is that you hope that all the studies get published as opposed to only the good ones, right? Because if you only publish certain ones, you can get a very biased view. So say you have a coin and you flip heads or tails. Every time it's heads, you count it. Every time it's tail, you just kind of hide it, right? That's going to give you a biased view of what's happening. Well, this is what they did in this study, is that they took 74 FDA-registered studies, of which 31% were never published. And the FDA sort of reevaluated all these studies and decided, did it support the use of antidepressants, or did it not support the use of antidepressants? And this is what they found, was that if you look at the journals the way they were published, so there's almost 50 articles published on various antidepressants. So you can see that almost all the studies that were published were positive. So if you were a doctor, you'd say, wow, it is overwhelmingly positive. Like, there is clear evidence from this evidence-based medicine that antidepressants are good medications. When the FDA went back and said, let's look at all the publications, let's look at the way they were published, and we're going to make our own determination if they're good or bad, this is actually what the FDA found of the exact same trials. it's like 50-50. They don't really work. There's an equal number of studies that show that the antidepressants don't work as to show it works. But if you're looking at the journal version of it, you'd say, as an evidence-based medicine practitioner, I think this stuff really works. But in fact, it's actually a toss-up. And it's because of selective publication. So yet another way that they bias it in favor of it. So you can look at neurodegenerative diseases, for example, so discontinuation and non-publication. Well, 12% of trials were discontinued. And if you look at if they're sponsored by industry versus university sponsored, what you see is that there's 5 times more likely to be unpublished if it's from the industry. And it's like, of course. If the industry, if Big Pharma does a study that shows that its drug is no good, it has the option of not publishing it. Why? Because it paid for it. So it simply gets rid of it. And that's how you wind up in this mess where you think that there's something very, very beneficial when it's actually not beneficial in the least. And it was because people are playing games. So this is another way that people do it. So if you look at, and this was published in the British Medical Journal, if you look at selective reporting from studies, the yellow boxes here are the pooled publications. And what you see is that, sorry, I can't really do this, but in the yellow box, what you see is that you can have one study of which they publish multiple studies. So one positive study, and they'll publish multiple publications from it. And then when they're not good, so if you look at the red bars, it says this orange circle is submitted study, primary result is significant, so a good study, and the blue circle is not significant. And then the green diamond is whether it was published or not. So if you look on the bottom, what you can see is for that drug, 4 of the orange circles got published, but only 1 of the blue ones are. The 3 other blue ones, which were negative studies, simply disappeared from the evidence. So if you were to look at that drug, for example, you'd say, wow, 4 out of 5 published trials say it's good. But there are actually 8 trials, 4 positive and 4 negative. And if you look at drug 5, for example, there's 5 studies done, out of which only 2 got published, the 2 positive ones. It's like, this is how we get into the mess, because you don't have to publish everything. So there's multiple publications, there's selective publications, and then selective reporting, because you can report trials that are positive that really aren't. So this is in 2008. If you track the trials, for example, you can see that, for example, in 2008, you had 92 studies that were completed by Sanofi. This is just one example, of which they only published 14. It's like, what do you think those ones they didn't publish were? Well, clearly, you only publish the stuff that's good for you, right? It's just like your kids. You say, oh, my kid got 96. That's what you tell your friends. You don't tell your friends, oh, yeah, my kid failed, like, math 3 times, right? The same thing. It's selective publication. They come out 92 times. They're like, oh, hey, yeah, my drug is so great. My kid is so great. Yeah, it's like, yeah, why is he held back 2 years, It's like, come on. But this is what we accept. We accept this of drug companies. It's like, but the problem is that people die because there are side effects to this, right? And we allow it. The fact is that we allow this to happen. So this is a very interesting trial where they looked at positive trials versus negative trials by year. So before year 2000, what you see is that a lot of trials were positive. 57% of trials were positive. After year 2000, only 8% were. And what was the difference? That was the year that everybody had to register what their endpoints were. So that means there is no more cheating, because what used to happen before 2000 is that you'd finish a trial and say your outcome was heart attacks. But you look at the data and it says, oh, the heart attack data is negative. So let's make it heart attacks and strokes and hospitalization. Does that work? And it's like, no? OK, well, let's add stubbing your toe. It's like, does that work? And it's like, yes, it works. OK, let's publish it. But you never meant to analyze all that stuff together. You just changed the goalposts. So before 2000, it was pretty easy to change the goalposts. And so every trial was positive, positive, positive. After 2000, all of a sudden, nothing works anymore. It's like 92% of trials were negative because the only thing you made them do was declare ahead of time what it is you're going to measure, right? So this is all about changing the goalposts. That's what used to happen. So every trial before year 2000 was more or less garbage. And that's what we base it on. This is what we base evidence-based medicine on. And this is a problem. Then you have crooked guidelines. So we know all about crooked physicians, and they don't think they're crooked, right? They think they're good people. But they take a lot of money from pharmaceuticals. But then they write guidelines which are obviously biased. So if you look at this, you can compare two guidelines, one with conflicts of interest and one with no conflicts of interest. So there are guidelines on how to write guidelines, for example. So there are red flags. So these are listed on the side. If your sponsor is a conflicted professional organization, that's a red flag. Industry sponsorship, multiple panelists are conflicted. They're all red flags, right? So certain ones will have a lot. So this, if you look at this single test for PSA, you can look. So on the left-hand side, you have the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force looking at PSA, saying is PSA a good test or a bad test? And you see that they actually pass all those red flags. So their guidelines committee is set up properly. There's nobody who's conflicted. The sponsor, the U.S. Preventive Health, they don't take industry money and all this sort of stuff. And basically what they say is that PSA is useless. Recommends against PSA screening. Okay, it's useless. At the very same time, you have the American Urological Association on the right, which does have multiple red flags. That is, they take a lot of money from industry. All the people who write the guidelines are taking money from industry, and sometimes a lot of money. And what they say is that they promote screening. In fact, we should lower the age of baseline screening to 40. It's like, oh my God, you're saying PSA saves lives, and the difference between the two, because they're looking at the same exact studies, is that one has conflicts of interest and the other does not. And this is not just for PSA, so here's antidepressants. So again, on the left-hand side, no conflicts of interest. You have the depression from Kaiser Permanente and the NICE guidelines. So you can see that there's really no red flags in the way they set up their committee to write the guidelines, and they say antidepressants are largely useless. So Kaiser Permanente recommends against it for mild to moderate, and the NICE actually explicit statement against prescribing, as in do not prescribe. They're useless or harmful. And the American Psychiatric Association, at the very same time, and you can see that they have a number of red flags. That's the only flag they have, right? It's all of it. They're taking a lot of money. There's a lot of sponsorship. Everybody is taking money. It's like, yes, we recommend antidepressants for the initial treatment of mild to moderate depression, or these drugs should be distributed like Halloween candy. These are the exact same trials they're looking at. It's the exact same data. The difference is how you make up the guidelines. And yet, when you have guidelines that start to come out, it's very difficult because then, as a practicing physician, if you don't prescribe these things, you could get nicked on not following the standard of practice. But the standard of practice is set by a number of physicians who have a large amount of conflicts of interest, right? And the stuff is like just so obvious, right? The Archives of Internal Medicine said failure of clinical practice guidelines, because these clinical practice guidelines, how to set up a committee to write guidelines, they've been around a long time, 2 more decades of little, if any, progress. And what they're saying is that if you look at the guidelines, since they initially published 20 years ago, and this is now 26 years ago, how to set up guidelines, they say, well, 71% of committee chairs had conflicts of interest. And 91% of co-chairs had conflicts of interest. In fact, that means the people who lead these guideline committee, they're on the take. right? And that's the big problem. So we haven't made any progress even though this issue was raised 26 years ago. So this is all the ways, this is the current state of evidence-based medicine, right? And this is why the insiders say evidence-based medicine, the way we have it with the financial conflicts of interest is largely useless or harmful because you have all of these problems, selective publications, you have rigged outcomes. Remember, you're just moving the goalposts, right? So if you don't declare ahead of time, you have advertorials, that is the people who work for the company, who write an editorial for the New England Journal of Medicine. You have reprint revenue, which is making a substantial contribution to the viability of that journal. Journal editors are on the take, there's publication bias, and then financial conflicts of interest like everywhere. And it's like, this is what we accept as our gold standard of how we should be treating patients. And you wonder why the public thinks that doctors are all crooked. It's like, unfortunately, they're probably right. That's the big problem. You have a bunch of corrupted journals, you have a bunch of corrupted physicians and researchers, and then the guy at the end of the line, the medical student, is coming in and being taught that how they should take all this evidence-based medicine, make sure everything is evidence-based, 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 but the base upon which you base it is corrupted. So this is the way it works, right? And unfortunately, this is true. So you have pharmaceutical companies who gives through glyphs, flattery and stuff. They target the doctors, the universities, the professors, because they're giving them sort of like 10 times or 15 times more than the individual doctors, which develop a favorable bias towards this drug of choice, which means more drugs are prescribed, which means more money for the pharmaceuticals, from which they can then pay the doctors again. And you see, this is the problem, is that people are catching on. They clearly see, and if you take the opioid crisis, this is exactly what happened. So the opioid company, Purdue, gave a lot of money to the doctors to say that, hey, if you are in pain, you can't get addicted. It's like, that actually wasn't true at all, but that's what I was taught in medical school. If you're in pain, you can't be addicted. And it's like, okay, we all learned that. A whole generation of doctors learned that, and it was not true at all. It was all just money going to the medical school. That's what was funding this message that was coming down to the medical student, which means we gave a lot of opioids, and then people died. A lot of people died. And now, in the newspaper, it's like, yeah, it's all the doctor's fault. It's like, yeah, because the doctors were the ones prescribing it. But we allowed that to happen, right? And unfortunately, everybody's sort of riding the gravy train, right? Everybody's on the take from all this. And when you have the complicit doctors to this sort of corruption of medicine, then people die. So look, the opioid crisis is a perfect example where doctors were not part of the solution. We were part of the problem. We're the ones prescribing it, and people are dying. Tobacco smoke. Smoking doesn't cause cancer. That was pretty common in the 60s and 70s. Lots of doctors came out in defense of smoking. Nutrition, obesity, type 2 diabetes. Sugar is a health food. Like, despite all the evidence, you have physicians who are coming out, like, you know, in the newspaper writing articles about how fructose should really be considered healthy for you. It's like, why? Because of the corruption in the system. And this is what I showed before. So this is how it works for doctors, right? So doctors are on the take everywhere throughout medicine. And it's okay. But would we accept it if it was a police officer? Like, what if people were giving your police officer, you know, here's a couple $100,000. Just look the other way while I do my drug deals, right? They'd be like, okay, there's no way you're allowed to give money to a police officer. It's like, you do that, then he's fired and you're in jail, right? No question about it. What if it's like a judge? Do we allow this for our judicials? Like a Supreme Court judge, oh yeah, he took a couple $100 million from this company. And no, not at all. It's not acceptable anywhere. And if you look at pharmaceutical companies, they actually have explicit bans on their employees getting gifts. It's like, Okay, so you know as a pharmaceutical that if somebody gives your employee a gift, that's going to corrupt them. But your whole modus operandi is to give gifts to doctors because you know it will corrupt them. It's like, wow, that is crazy. And then everybody thinks I'm super anti-pharma. It's like, I'm not. A pharmaceutical company, a big pharmaceutical company, should be doing that. Its whole purpose is to sell drug. And if you say you're allowed to bribe doctors, then they should bribe doctors because that's why they're there, to make money. The problem is that the doctors are doing a really lousy job policing themselves and saying, we can't be taking money because our job is not to make ourselves rich. Our job is to protect the health of our population. So there must be rules on this. But yet, the people who are in charge of making the rules are getting the most money. So that's why there's no rules. That's why you have a CEO of the Memorial Sloan Kettering. Like, you know how huge that is? Like, that is like one of the top cancer hospitals in the world. This is one of the top cancer researchers of the last decade. They're all just corrupt. It's like, that is not the problem. That is not the way to do it. So the thing is that there's actually a fairly easy solution, right? Unfortunately, this is very low font. So the solution is really that any doctor or researcher who teaches at a medical school or university, you really just shouldn't be getting all of this money. You shouldn't be getting any of it. And it might sound really bad, but you're actually just following the same rules that you would apply to a kindergarten teacher or a policeman or a judge or somebody who worked at the DMV, right? If you work at the DMV and somebody gave them $50 or something, they'd get fired. If you gave, your New York City policeman a cup of lemonade on a hot day, he could get fired. You're not allowed to do that. They're not allowed to take stuff. They're not allowed to take gifts. Like, teachers are not allowed to take a couple $100 from a parent. Like, everybody would be up in arms. But yet, when you give a couple $100,000 to these doctors, hey, it's okay. It's okay. It's the way it works, right? And as a medical student, you actually think it's okay because everybody around you is doing it, and all of your mentors are doing it. The people you look up to, the people you try to emulate, they're the ones going on that trip to Hawaii. And you go, okay, I want to grow up and be just like that. I'm going to take drug money and go to Hawaii because that's what doctors do. And it shouldn't be. There should be clear rules on that. And universities can do that. Organizations that publish guidelines should not have any financial conflicts of interest. And every committee member who writes a guideline should not have financial conflicts of interest. And editors of journals should not have conflicts of interest. Like, these are not like, they're really not that much to ask. They're really just trying to follow the rules of everybody else. And this is how we get into the mess, because what happens, of course, is that if everything that we believe has been, so tainted, then you can make arguments that sugar is a health food, that opioids are good for you, and all this stuff, but it harms patients. And we always have to remember that at the end of the day, this is not why we became doctors. The reason we became doctors was to help people, but we're not until we kind of set those same rules as everybody else. And it's not something that you can just do by yourself, which is why I think, I'm so grateful to Greg for having me here, because this is the whole point of having something like CrossFit Health that can point out to the people who do make the rules that, hey, we need to save doctors from themselves. Because if we don't, we're going to lose all credibility. We have, for the most part, and if you look at all these articles in the New York Times, like, we have to be safe from ourselves. We have to apply the same rules that everybody else applies them to, because we have good evidence now that it is harmful, that we are harming people, and if we don't do something about it, we're gonna have more problems in the future. We're gonna have obesity problems. It took forever to get the smoking, bans and all that stuff, because there are so many doctors that said it was. There was no link to lung cancer. We had so many doctors that said opioids were good for you. Right? And that's the real problem. That's it for me. Thank you.